much better if you're not around.
Yes. My name is Waldo Moore. I'm on the staff of the Copyright Office. We're meeting here today, April 13, 1977, in the Copyright Office. And present are two distinguished figures in the copyright world. First, Abraham L. Kaminstein, an official of the Copyright Office for some 25 years and Register of Copyrights from 1960 until his retirement 10 years later. And with us also Mr. Herman Finkelstein, a distinguished New York lawyer and for many years General Counsel to ASCAP. And we're really here to hear Mr. Kaminstein ask some questions of Mr. Finkelstein, and we're all anxious to hear both the questions and the answers.
Oh, you're too modest, Waldo. You have a position here to tell them what that is.
Well, Mr. Kaminstein insists, and as my former boss, he still has some authority around here, and so he asked me to tell my title. I will. I'm the Assistant Register of Copyrights for Registration.
And Herman has been a member of the panel and which with me on many conventions. So, Herman, what happened in Geneva in 1952 when you were part of the U.S. delegation? I'm particularly interested in Article 5, the translation provisions.
Well, in those days, that was a convention in which the U.S. delegation was headed by Luther Evans, then Librarian of Congress. And Luther's function as chairman was to see that the members of this delegation, all of whom represented different interests, and who were going to carry different provisions of the convention, that there was some harmony in the U.S. delegation. And we'd have some meetings that ran until 3 o'clock in the morning of the U.S. delegation, and Luther would say as we adjourned, we'll meet at 8 o'clock in the morning, just in case anybody has some new thoughts between now and the time we meet. My role in the convention was to handle the Article 5, which was the right of translation. And on that, there were 3 points of view. One was that the right of translation in this convention that wasn't going to guarantee any rights, except this one right, the right of translation. There was one view that certainly this low-level convention shouldn't give a greater right of translation than the Berne Convention did. And the Berne Convention permitted contracting states to take a reservation on the right of translation. Then some delegations, Greece and Turkey and some others, didn't think there ought to be any right of translation at all. And our basic feeling for the U.S. delegation, in which basically I think the French and others in the Berne Convention joined, was that the right of translation should be as complete as other rights, but we were willing to make concessions in order for the provision to go through.
Yeah. You came with a position paper for the U.S., which, as I remember it, said you were going to strike for 10 years.
Yes, when you say we're going to strike for 10 years, that is that there would be no compulsory license giving the right in other countries to translate without permission after a given period of time, that time being 10 years. And my recollection is that at the convention, the best we could get that had a chance of getting through was 7 years. But we still had the problem of overcoming these other positions. We didn't want to overcome the flat position of an absolute right of translation, but we knew realistically you would never get it through. It would be perfectly all right with us if it could go through, but it just couldn't, and we wanted a right of translation. So we were, in the end, we had our position, the position of our position paper sustained, except the 10 years was cut down to 7.
And what was the role of John Schulman in all this? I remember Luther Evans saying to me, boy, John Schulman was certainly difficult in this respect.
Well, John fancied himself as the authority on all the sections of the convention, and he felt that really that he should be the person who determined the policy of the U.S. delegation. I remember one morning after Sidney Kay and I left one of the U.S. delegation meetings. This one wasn't so bad. This broke up at 2:00 in the morning, and Sidney and I were saying to each other, why no client could ever engage us for any kind of money to do this kind of work. I was surprised that Sidney, whom I considered to a great extent an adversary because the organization he represented was owned by broadcasters, I was surprised that Sidney and I could reach agreement faster than John Schulman and I, who were supposed to be on the same side of the fence.
My experience was that it was almost always easier to reach agreement with the other countries than reach agreement with my own delegation.
Oh, well, one of the great things about a U.S. delegation is that it always represents all points of view. And the fact that we could reach common agreement is a great tribute to the human nature.
Was expressed you in itself.
Yes.
Well, who was the leading light on the convention as a whole outside the U.S. delegation?
I suppose there was that Frenchman who,
Dupas?
No, I don't think so. Of course, France always takes a great lead in the international conventions. I found that in dealing with what we now call the developing countries, Herman Fernandez del Castillo of Mexico he helped us greatly in working out something on the right of translation.
India was the main...
Locur of India, yes.
The Indians were the main obstacle to Section 5.
They wanted the absolute right. They wanted the absolute right to ignore the author's rights in respect to translation. Yes. There ought not to be any. Yes. That they said this was a low-plane convention, that in no other respect did it guarantee any rights, that in the Berne Convention there was a right of reservation, and for something on a lower plane there should be no right of translation at all.
And Locur was very good. I wish he had been at Stockholm because we missed him, because he knew something about copyright, and a man who took his place at Stockholm was a good man, but a politician, not first in copyright. Well, were you all satisfied with the results of the convention?
Of the Universal
Yeah.
Copyright Convention? Well, of course, I would have preferred that we follow the route of the
Burn.
of Byrne, which we would have done if the Shotwell Committee, the bill formulated by the Shotwell Committee and introduced by Senator Thomas of Utah, if that had been adopted. I would much have preferred that. I never did like a low plane of protection naturally. On the other hand, I did feel that the United States should not be outside the
Well, that was the
international
main
system.
purpose of our starting this at all.
Yes, bear in mind the three countries outside the international system of protection were Russia, China, and the United States. And we were the first one to take some, start some movement for at least us to get in.
And at Stockholm, the talk was if Russia and the United States would join the Berne Convention, would be a happy day.
And I think that if we would both join the Berne Convention, they would tailor it to suit our needs.
Well. Let's go to Rome, 1950, 61, the Neighboring Rights Convention. We had the largest delegation there, and on the evening before it started, you approached me with some proposition, which I turned down immediately, that the Italians were not happy with the man who was supposed to be head of the conference itself, and you suggested that would I consider it. I said no. What sparked that? It came to me in another way too, in another. What was the reason behind that?
Yeah, I don't remember that specifically. Of course, I was unhappy
Yeah.
with the whole Rome Convention setup. I talked to Herman Kennan, who represented the Musicians Union. He was president of the Musicians Union.
And
And
he
I said-
was there.
He was there. And I said, now, here, I said, if you're going to have a convention that gives the artist a right, treats him as an author, then the copyright should flow from him. But you're agreeing to a convention where the record company gets the copyright, which is tantamount to saying that authors ought to agree that their publishers should be the initial copyright owner. And I said, I can't buy that. I said, I'm not persuaded that this is a right that the United States ought to subscribe to.
Well,
But if they were to subscribe to it, I think it should be the artist's right and not the record company's right. And after a while, I'd been there a couple of days, and I saw there was no chance in the wide world of changing this format. And I said that I was wasting my time in Rome. And I said that I thought I could accomplish much more by tending to my knitting at home, and I wanted to go back.
at that point, I talked to Congressman Lebanati and asked him to apply pressure to keep you in Rome, and he did.
He did apply that pressure. He said that there was a feeling that if I went back at this time, I would run down to Washington and tell members of Congress that this convention was not in the interest of the United States, and there would be nobody to answer that because they were all in Rome, and that he knew that I wouldn't do that kind of thing, but I could best be insulated against an attack on the ground that I was doing it by staying in Rome. He said if I did stay to the end of the convention, he personally would drive me to the airport for a plane the next Sunday morning that was leaving at 6 in the morning. With the pressure coming from the chairman of the delegation, who was on the Patents Committee of the House, I yielded, and he kept his promise. He did take me to the took my wife, Betty, and me to the airport at 6 that morning.
I never attended a meeting where there was so much disharmony in the U.S. delegation itself, because at one point I asked the delegation to advise me on what to do next morning. That next morning I was flooded with telegrams from the United States in all directions. And I was favored with a call from the head of the Labor Department here, who was Goldberg. And,
Justice Goldberg.
yeah, and he pleaded with me to take another look at how the convention was treating labor. When I got back, I saw him here in Washington, and I suggested to him that we all get together and push for what we wanted, not to disturb me, who knew what was going on, and at midnight we talk about working later hours. When I got back to the United States, I attended a meeting in New York where I was literally torn apart. After all the meetings before we went to Rome, after a while I got used to the idea, and I felt we ought to do what we could without struggling, and it took years to bring the broadcasters around, and it was not until one of the broadcasting companies found that their music division was pulling them out of the hole that they agreed to support the Neighboring Rights Convention. What a funny name that is anyway.
But we haven't approved that
No.
convention, have we?
No.
And we're not likely
No,
to.
but we are getting close to approving it, because the broadcasting people have what they want in the Reykjavik Piracy Convention, and I see the time when they will come around to it. Not completely, but
See, this subject will come up
yeah.
on the question of whether there should be a performance right in phonograph
Yeah.
records. That's something that
Yeah.
Senator Scott sponsored. And the Copyright Office is charged, the Register of Copyrights is charged under the new law with an obligation to report
Yes.
on that subject.
Well, I testified at one point that we were all in favor of the Copyright Office was in favor of it for performance rights. I always felt that there was enough pie so that it, no matter how small it was, the portion of it would even out.
That has been around for a long time. Way back,
Yeah.
Sidney Diamond's father, Milton, represented the AFM. And he came up to me one day and he said, now, ASCAP lies in a big wide bed all we want you to do is move over and make room for us. I told Milton that it wasn't that easy.
Well, it was an experience I never will forget, but now I'll look back on it and I see it was good for me anyway. So, it was a good experience for me.
Yes, you see, it's natural that we who are going to be adversely affected by a convention.
That's why we put you all on the delegation.
Oh, surely.
Yeah.
But we have to look at it quite differently from the way the officials of the United States do.
Yes.
The United States must attend these conventions and do the best it can under all the circumstances and try to get some agreement among the parties. Here was one where it was just impossible to get agreement, which explains why the convention has never been approved.
Yes.
But we do have to attend them. We have to have a position, and the position ultimately has to be made by whoever discharges the responsibility at the government level.
I felt there were no more than 5 people on the convention itself who knew what was really going on. And one of them was Arpad Bosch, and one of the other was Bodenhausen. And I think you were trying to get me to act as head of the whole conference because you wanted to see a low-level convention, if anything was adopted. And I had enough to contend with running the delegation.
I think that's a fair statement, yes. Unlike UCC, where I wanted to see the protection at as high a level as
Yes,
possible
yeah.
for any right relating to phonograph records,
Yeah.
I felt that, yes, they were entitled to a right to prevent unauthorized duplication, but I hadn't gotten around to the point where the record company
Yeah.
should have the additional right of performance. And I thought that if Abe Kaminstein headed up the convention, at least we would know where we were going, and that, of course, it's always an advantage, I think, if your own country can head the thing up,
Well,
and you
I
have
thought-
confidence in the person.
How did you know I would know enough to do that?
Oh, well, I had observed you for a long time. I formed judgments fast, but I didn't have to form this one fast.
Well, I thought I could be more helpful as a rapporteur general.
And that was a
Yeah.
great. That was a good job in reporting it.
Boy, we stayed up all that night with 2 secretaries to dictate, and took the girls home early in the morning, and iPad working like mad because we had a reporter the next day,
Yes.
and then only report the guts of the convention. The conference gave me a long time to finish up the rest of the report.
Well, I haven't changed my views very much on the
No, I
Rome
don't.
Convention.
Let's go to the preparations for the Stockholm Convention, almost 10 years ago.
1967, yes.
That was a long convention, a long preparation for a convention, it usually takes some 20 years or 30 years before amending a convention, and this one has started way back during the war. And the Stockholm Convention was a huge undertaking. It covers not only copyright, which was the main subject of the conference itself, but also patents and the setting up of what is now called WIPO. So they had a week of patents, or a few days of patents, and then they went to copyright. Now, in the preparation for the conference, we had many meetings. One that I remember particularly occurred 2 years before Stockholm in Geneva. And the conference took place in the ILO building. And I remember it one time we were walking back to our hotel, and you insisted on carrying my briefcase. Now, I had a heart attack, but I could still carry my briefcase. So I always referred to it as the most important briefcase carry I ever had.
I remember that very well. That was up a hill.
Yeah.
Now, if it were on a level piece of ground, I would have felt you could carry your own briefcase.
And going downhill, you carried yours. Is that true?
I carried both up.
Well, I
No, but this
remember,
was going uphill,
Yes,
and
sir.
Cammy had
Well.
a heart attack, and I felt we needed him. Purely selfish, you understand.
Yeah, I know. And I remember once when you and your wife took a trip up the lake, and she came back and presented Mr. Fuchs and I with strawberries from Vevey with a little note. These are not very good strawberry, but the best I can find. If you come to my place in Bucks County, I'll show you what real strawberries should taste like.
I remember that very well. Betty had heard you saying to somebody that you liked strawberries. And here we were in the greatest strawberry producing country in the world, I guess, section in the world. And, oh yes, we climbed the hill there to get what Betty, to where Betty considered the best strawberries were in Vevey.
Now, to go to Stockholm, the delegation was headed by Batterman, who was the head of the Undersecretary of State for Business Practices, and I was head of the copyright section under him. But I remember his instruction to the delegation as a whole. None of you are to speak to other members of any other delegation until you have checked with me. I said, that's silly. In the case of Herman Finkelstein and Sidney King, they don't have to speak to any other delegation. They have colleagues whom they deal with every day. And I'm sure that you and Sidney K. made your wishes known to other members of the other delegation without having to talk to them?
Well, on some occasions, I found out what the United States delegation was thinking by being approached by members of delegations of other countries who wanted to get my view on something advanced by the U.S. delegation that I didn't know had been advanced. And I would then, now I didn't go to these people, you understand, they went to me. And I'd have to go to the head of the U.S. delegation and want to know why we advanced a certain position or what we meant in advancing it, and tell him what I could assure him a foreign delegation would do once we knew what we were really after. Yes, that was a problem.
Yeah. And the problem, we had the largest delegation in any other country on the floor, and seating them on the floor of the convention was quite a problem. We had we were meeting in the hall of the legislator of Stockholm, and they so arranged it that we would have the hall as soon as the legislator recessed for the summer, and it was a beautiful hall, and we have asked for as many seats as they could spare, and it still wasn't enough. So we got more seats eventually, but in the meantime, we had a devil of, because members of the delegation themselves were upset by being pushed aside or having to sit in the galleries.
It turned out that the developed countries had not done their homework with each other, and the developing countries had formulated a plan of attack that turned out to be irresistible. And the result was that they were able to get through some provisions in the Stockholm Convention that put us in a position where, if that was approved, if that became part of the Berne Convention, then we lost we who wanted to get into the Berne Convention lost any interest, because at that stage Universal would be on a far higher plane than Berne. And the question then was, how do you overcome this wrecking of the Berne Convention?
Well, it was a problem, and of course I was under Mr. Bradman's direction, and when the Bodenhausen, who was was what then called BP, approached me and pleaded with me to talk to the Indians. I had to refer to Bradman, and he said no. So it was a lovely time to be in Stockholm, but we were stymied in all directions because we were only observers, and we had no real, everybody knew we were interested in what happened there, but we couldn't do very much.
Were there any clues that the developing countries were going to come forth with this beforehand?
No, if we hadn't sense enough to see, because they had met before the conventions, and I said I've seen it coming when I went to Brazzaville before. But as a result, we spent the next 5 years trying to correct what happened at Stockholm.
Which takes us to that Paris meeting, 1971.
And we had Barbara shuttled back and forth between here and Paris and London for so much that last year before the Paris meeting that I said we ought to open an office in London and Paris. But she did a remarkable job, including we tried originally both meetings. We had not only the Bern Convention and the UCC and the same time in Paris. We had also scheduled the Piracy Convention at the same time because we knew that couldn't be, but we thought it was good time to get all this out together, and the expense of holding a convention itself was a factor. And we met one meeting which had the summer before Paris took place in Paris, and the question was whether to schedule the Piracy Convention at the same time or postpone it. And the question was whether Stroessner and the guy who was head of the Sterling and his superior, who represented the phonograph interest, would agree to the post movement. And the question was whether they could agree on what was to be submitted to the Convention of Brexit Piracy. And the one thing that they couldn't agree on was a clause in the convention which Norbert Stroessner and his opponent agree on. So I said, well, let's take a look at it and see if we can work out a compromise. And over the weekend, Bob took the drafting off and came back with a conference, to the conference with the agreement, which both of them had agreed. And the Englishman told me later, how could Barbara work out something which I had talked to Stroessner again and again? And I said, they worked together on other things and they trusted each other. So
I thought Stroessner was one of the most brilliant
he is.
fellows. I was going to say operators, but he just was brilliant. And the only thing that I had against the broadcasters was that they discovered Stroessner before we did, because I would have loved to have him on our side.
Well, they tried, the broadcasters in this country one of the firms in Washington tried to hire not to represent him, and he was not interested.
Very
Uh,
interesting.
But to go to Paris, you were in and out of that meeting. You had
On the recording rights, I felt that that was really outside of the area in which I was directly concerned. That wasn't going to be a performance right, that was a recording right. A right to prevent unauthorized copying. And I felt there were others in the United States who could support that position without my having to be around for that. So I was just in and out on that one. But I was concerned very much with the modification of the Universal Copyright Convention in Paris. For which, incidentally, in preparation for which, that Washington conference was a terrific thing,
Yeah.
because everything was really settled
Yeah.
at the Washington conference.
It
And,
was amazing to me because ordinarily I said it takes 20 years to prepare for a revision of any major convention, and here was just 5 years before, since Stockholm, and we were having another meeting to revise both the Bern and the UCC.
Didn't you didn't you write an article on the Stockholm Convention that was indicated pretty much that copyright has reached its low point at Stockholm? I forget where you wrote it, but
I said as much, and I said we couldn't join Bern if this wasn't revised. And everybody, in fact, I made a speech once in Geneva, which was written by Barbara, and on the spur of the moment, she, it was, we were at a meeting in Geneva, not in the ILO headquarters, but in the convention that in charge of communications.
EBU. Was it the European Broadcasting Union?
No,
No.
it was in the building right opposite on the other side of the avenue. The something to do with the satellites. And it was a meeting of the governing body of the UCC, and it came up just before luncheon, and Barbara went off and drafted a speech which I showed to Harvey Winter when she got back, and I made it, and the entire U.S. delegation went out that evening and congratulated us. And but to get back to Paris, Barbara worked night and day on a report which the head of the English delegation, when she read it on the floor of the convention, I was sitting there dumb because I couldn't speak. But he said it was not only Bidian report, but as one is bleakly slang language as the Americans sometimes. It was how did he put it? It was a very creative report, and I think it was.
Was Sir John Clark still alive then? He was the rapporteur.
Yeah, he
Um,
had died.
He had died, yes.
He was
He was great.
beautiful.
Yes. The British have always been very good at trying to resolve conflicting positions, I thought. But the thing that I admired about them mostly was their being right at home at in these conferences, and knowing when to speak and speaking out, and never wasting any time on things that weren't necessary.
They were always very good. The only chairman that I didn't like of the British delegation was the guy who showed up in Stockholm, and he was good, but not at the caliber of the other.
Did he come out of the patent office?
Yeah.
That's what I thought, yes. He was the wrong man for the job. He didn't have the right background.
Well,
That's a narrow view for somebody in the copyright area.
but at least they hang on to their men. Was of all the convention, they don't shift back and forth.
No. Now, Wallace was
Yeah,
splendid.
yeah.
He knew what it was all about. He both had a knowledge of the content of what was going on, and an ability to understand other people, and being able to sit down with them.
So has Hesser and Ulmer,
Yes.
of course.
Yes, Elmer is very able. He's a little bit more domineering than the
Yeah.
British.
And I remember one time in Stockholm, he forgot to cover his mic and in front of them, and he said something out loud which he shouldn't have said. Waldo, have you any questions?
I want to ask you something about the future and something about the past, the distant past and the distant future, I guess, too. Where do you see, with modern developments and the changes that are taking place, where do you see the world of copyright going? What do you see as the future for the rights of all?
Yes. One thing, I don't think too many years will pass before we get into the Berne Convention where we belong. I think that with a term of copyright based on the life of the author and the number of years after his death, 50 years, that the copyright notice has outlived its usefulness, except to entrap somebody who just happens not to be aware of a date to do something. They don't have copyright. They don't have any formalities in the Berne Convention countries, and they get along on that basis all right. And I think that once you get to the point where an author's work comes under the federal system, as soon as it's fixed, in fixed form, and you do away with the distinction between publication and unpublished works, I think you should go the next step and do away with the copyright notice. Once we do that, then the only problem that we have, because we're doing away with a manufacturing clause over a period of time, the only problem we have is the moral right, and I think that our decisional law is about the same as the British. And the British are able to join
Yes.
the Berne Convention with the moral rights provision. And I suppose the Berne Convention, to get us in, I'm pretty sure they would have some provision that makes it clear that our law relating to moral rights, the alienability, satisfies the requirements of the Berne Convention.
Haven't we gone halfway to the abolishment of the notice in the new law?
Yes, now the failure to put on a notice doesn't absolutely destroy your copyright. You have a period of time within which you can correct the mistake.
And
But I think it ought to go beyond that.
I agree.
That's the
but-
first
yeah.
step.
And people get used to it under the new law. I think that will come about.
I agree with you on that. I get impatient about things at times, but I think yes that that will get us there, and it's a good first step. So that now one problem in copyright is that in countries where broadcasting is controlled by the government, those governments begin to take the position of users. And whereas in the past, many countries that now have government broadcasting were in the front line in protecting the author's rights, now they're often in the front line in wanting the right to take something without the author's consent and possibly without compensation.
Yes. Yes.
So there are the two movements I see in
Yes.
two different directions.
In other words, what you're gaining on the one hand, you're losing perhaps
We
from this
may-
angle of view
yes.
through the compulsory license.
And
Yes,
that's what
but-
held up the satellite business, because countries are afraid of giving the other countries a right to broadcast in their countries.
Yes.
An interesting thing about the satellite convention was that Kenya was chosen as the site for the meeting,
Yes.
for the convention, because they have an Earth station there that reaches a satellite, and they had intercepted the signals in the Olympics that came from Mexico.
I see.
And Brett, that reminds me that of Strashnov, who used to stow up at these conventions representing Monaco and another country, and
Tunisia.
and one time he was accused of voting twice.
Yes.
To go back into the past now, when the decision was made by your law partner and predecessor as the chief attorney for ASCAP, or for what became ASCAP, to form such an organization, did they turn to any particular already existing organization as a model, or?
Oh yes. That my predecessor as general counsel, whom you refer as Nathan Burke.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He never had a partner.
Uh-huh.
That was a one-man law firm.
I see. You were associated
we were all
with him,
associated
though.
with
Yes,
him.
I see. Yes.
Yes, the French Society, which was formed in 1851, was the model for ASCAP, but then we had to take into consideration that this was a different country, we had a different copyright law,
Yes, sure.
different standards,
Yes.
and a different, whereas they were mostly composers in the standard field and publishers in that
Yes.
field. We were mostly in the popular field.
Uh-huh.
And many of our publishers were just reprint houses they reprinted
Yes.
foreign works in the standard field.
Yes.
So the ASCAP started primarily in the popular field, and the standard, we call the serious writers standard writers, we did in those days
Yes.
anyway. They really came into ASCAP in 1921, we had a meeting once when the ASCAP music was off the air in 1940-41.
Yes.
We met at Abram Chasen's home and we had a discussion about serious writers and popular writers. And Abram said, well, now let's see, you call some writers popular writers. Why don't you call the rest of us unpopular writers? We also at one of those meetings, somebody said, well, the broadcasters must have some Achilles heel that we could find. And Deems Taylor said, well, the trouble is that there are a lot of broadcasters not named Achilles.
He's got to reload his. When the copyrighted music went off the air, could you tell us something about that as one who was involved in it all?
Yes. You see, ASCAP used to make contracts with the broadcasters for a 5-year period. The first contract on a percentage basis was made in 1932 for a 3-year period.
Huh.
And the rate was 3% the first year, 4% the second, 5% the third. Now that contract expired in 1935, and then a 5-year contract was made at the 5% rate.
Yes.
When I say 5%, that's a percentage of what the broadcasters get from their advertisers for announcements on the broadcasting station, less certain
Yes.
agreed discounts or reductions. Now the networks didn't pay anything for network programs, and ASCAP was getting a lot of reaction from stations that were affiliates of the networks, claiming that ASCAP and the networks were in combination to foist that charge on the station, the charge that should have been paid by the networks.
Yes.
In fact, out in the state of Montana, in Missoula County, I think it was Hellgate Township, I'm not sure about the exact name of the township, a criminal information was filed against ASCAP officers and the network officers, charging them with extortion. And Gene Buck was out in Phoenix, Arizona one evening, and he was made an honorary chief of police. Next morning, the sheriff who pinned this badge on him called on him and said he had a warrant for his arrest from Montana. Gene thought it was a gag, but he ended up with his picture being taken with a sheriff holding on to him on the jailhouse steps. This was Washington's birthday, and our office was closed, and they were fixing bail at $25,000. Now, finally, Gene was able to get the then senior partner of our firm, who said, well, the banks are closed, and but we finally got in touch with the surety company that wrote our surety bonds, and got them to get in touch with the Phoenix authorities. And the sheriff said that they didn't recognize this bonding company, Massachusetts bonding company, had never heard of them. And this had to be a cash bond. And we were able to get in touch with one of our clients on the West Coast, A.C. Blumenthal, who just happened to have a certified check on the Chase Bank. And so that was flown out.
Yes.
And the sheriff said, well, they never heard of the Chase Bank. And finally, we were able to get the Fox West Coast Theaters to get together, as run by the Skouras brothers, to get together $25,000 in cash. They had that put up as a bond, and the sheriff then said, we don't take cash here. And the only way, now this all happened within a few hours,
Yes.
but Gene was in jail all this time. protective custody, of course.
Yes.
The sheriff said that there was a bonding company out there. I think he had an interest in it.
Yes.
And they wrote the bond. Now then, Gene wasn't going to be subject to that kind of charge anymore. So from here out, when the next contract came up, the networks were going to have to pay. So in 1940, when we announced the terms of a
Yes.
new contract,
Yes.
Ed Klauber, who was executive vice president of CBS, came to this meeting with some other broadcasters. And when it was announced that the networks would have to pay in the future, and the rate that we offered a license to the networks for was 7.5% as against 5% to the
Oh, yes.
stations. And then we knew that we'd need some allies among the broadcasting industry, so we lowered the rates for the smaller stations from 5 to 3%, for the intermediate stations to 4%, and then for the top stations kept it at 5. But the networks would be 7.5.
Uh-huh.
And when Klauber heard that being read at this meeting, he said to a young lawyer who was with him, who had been a classmate of mine at the Yale Law School, Joe Ream, "Get my hat," and stalked out of the room. Now, ASCAP made a very serious mistake at that time. The ASCAP executives wrote a letter to CBS that in any future negotiations not to send Ed Klauber. Now, I think one thing you have to recognize when you negotiate with anybody, they're entitled to have anybody they want, and that person is entitled to say anything he wants to say. This is something I found it very difficult to make my clients understand. But that has to be a basic principle of negotiation. Because otherwise, if you don't accord your adversary those rights, he's not going to accord them to you, and that means you're not going to get together. But anyway, Klauber stalked out of the room, and the networks had previously formed BMI. They'd formed BMI in May of 1938, but they kept it inactive to see what was going to happen here.
That's very interesting. It was not formed then after.
It was formed in
before.
anticipation
Uh-huh.
of what might happen.
I see. That's very
And each of the two networks, there were three networks, but two of the networks were owned by the National Broadcasting Company, the red and the blue, and the other was the CBS. The two network organizations each put up $1.25 million to start BMI going, and BMI was activated. Now they got two publishing companies that had felt they weren't getting the right amount from ASCAP, Edward B. Marks and Ralph Peer. Marks turned all of his copyrights over to BMI. Peer turned over only those copyrights that were written, songs written by ASCAP members before they became members. Peer recognized that if they wrote something after they were members, that ought to stay in ASCAP. And so he organized Peer International, which he turned over to BMI. Then there was some litigation on the question of, with E.B. Marks, on the question of whether BMI had the right to license those works. But that all came a little bit later. Right now we have our music off the air. They took the music off the air November 1st. The contract expired December 31st. But they took the music off the air November 1st to be sure that they could keep ASCAP music off the air without any great repercussions. Now, some of the people in ASCAP thought come January 1st and they couldn't play any ASCAP music, New Year's Eve, that they'd be running back, for an ASCAP license. But it didn't turn out that way at all. The broadcasters were able to go to their advertisers and say, if you don't play ball with us, we'll have to pay ASCAP whatever they want, and your advertising rates will go up. And so the public didn't seem to miss the ASCAP music, at least not, they didn't make themselves felt through the, at the marketplace, which was the advertiser. And that music was off the air for a whole year until November
Wow.
1st, 1941. And the ASCAP writers, ASCAP had a reserve fund of about $3 million that it had saved up over the years, and that was going to the writers lower down in the scale.
Yes.
And that was exhausted. The publishers didn't participate in the reserve fund, but they were about ready to go bankrupt because they had their staffs and they weren't having any new songs marketed. So that unless ASCAP made a deal, the whole thing would collapse. We started some negotiations with the broadcasters in August, with the networks. In August of 1941, Bob Myers of NBC representing the broadcasters and I representing ASCAP, and we worked out a deal at the end of October of that year. Some of the people in the National Association of Broadcasters thought that the networks ought not to sign up even then, that if they held out for a while longer, the price would be lower than it was.
Mhm.
They cut the price in half. But the networks did take a license. And the Department of Justice, I think, was instrumental in seeing that they took a license.
Oh, that's
because
great.
that was something within the broadcasting family.
I see.
But the license was at half the rate that broadcasters had paid in the past, and 1/3 of the rate that we quoted, 2.5%.
Yes.
But the broadcasting industry, the NAB had offered ASCAP a 10% increase to make a deal on a dollar basis, provided the broadcasting industry could allocate that money among broadcasters,
Oh, I
the obligation
see.
to pay any way they wanted,
Uh-huh.
so that the network still would not pay.
Uh-huh.
And we wouldn't go along with that. So our first year we got half as much instead of 10%
Yes.
more. But I think over the years, the good judgment was validated. Today, ASCAP takes in about $85 million a year, of which I think about 75% comes from broadcasting.
Yes.
And at that time, in 1935, I don't think the ASCAP income was over $5 million.
Oh, interesting.
If it had gone on a dollar basis, ASCAP wouldn't be anywhere near
Yes.
anywhere near the position it's in now.
Oh, very
So it was good judgment to insist on staying on a percentage basis
Yes.
and turning down the extra money at that time.
Yes.
Well, I worked out the agreement that brought the music back on the air, and then ASCAP wanted me to come over there full time,
Yes.
and I came over there on January 1st, 1943. I thought I'd come over for only 3 years. I felt that in my development as a lawyer, I basically had a knowledge of research. I'd been law clerk to Judge Learned Hand and Judge Swan, so I had a pretty good knowledge of brief writing and how you approach a court. And I had had a lot of litigation experience with Nathan Birkin. I used to go to court with him. But what I didn't have was the ability to deal with a client on a day-to-day basis. And I felt that if I went over to ASCAP and had to devote all my time to them, that was one thing I'd learned. But they had so many problems over the years, and they always made it very attractive. I never had a question with ASCAP about remuneration. I threatened to leave many times, and each time they would offer me more money to stay. That's true, but I didn't want to leave because I wasn't getting enough. I just felt
found
that I
for being
ought
in the government it's quite the other way about. They show you this way to the egress.
I had one situation with ASCAP where I'd gotten into some environmental problems out in Bucks County, and they attracted me, and I thought time had come when maybe I ought to change my field. And I went back to ASCAP and told them that I thought they ought to begin to think about my leaving because I wanted to go into this other
Yes.
field. And you know, that's a case where wanting to do something good for the public ends up to your own personal benefit. They gave me $10,000 more to stay. But it always was a very pleasant relationship.
Well, I thought I came to the copyright office, I would give it a year. I stayed 22 years. But to go back to ASCAP troubles, when I first went around to talk about revision on the Hill, the congressman or senator would say, "Oh, you're talking about the jukebox." How does ASCAP gain the reputation it did?
Of copyright and jukebox being synonymous?
No.
Well,
no,
Oh, you mean how did we overcome that? Well, I thought that it was possible to spend time with the Department of Justice. Sort of had that view too, that ASCAP was just interested in getting all the money it could, period. And I felt that ASCAP had a responsibility to its members. It was the one organization in the field that represented writers and publishers, and had some money. And I felt that I could, that it was important for me to spend time educating the Department of Justice and members of Congress, not on a narrow basis, but just on the importance of rights of authors being observed. This was a form of property that, and I've never been interested in anybody but the professional author. I'm not interested in the dilettante, but somebody who wants to earn a living by writing ought to be encouraged in every legitimate way that you can do it. And I think, and another thing is changing the nature of ASCAP so that anybody who wanted to find out about the inner workings of ASCAP could do it without any reluctance on our part. Quite the contrary, inviting people in public positions
and
to look into everything.
the Nathan Birkin Memorial Prize was a way to do that as well.
Yes, we, our problem, and Nathan Birkin talked to me about this many times, he said our big problem is that the judges don't think of copyright as a form of property. Our adversaries are represented by lawyers who never heard of copyright, and least of all had gotten any sympathy toward the thing. And so we had a big educational problem. Now legislators and judges begin their view of things that will come up during their professional lives. They begin that in law school. And when Nathan Birkin died, just doing what I thought he would do if he were there,
Yes.
telling us what we might do, that the best way to honor him was by starting a competition in the law schools. Very few law schools taught law.
Copyright
And today,
law, yes.
taught copyright law.
Yes.
And today, most of the younger teachers of copyright started with won the Nathan Birkin competition at
Yes.
law schools. That's Mel Nimmer,
Yeah.
Arthur Miller, even John Wilson over in the Department of Justice
Yeah.
started winning competition at the University of Michigan.
Yes.
And Paul Goldstein at the University of the State of
Yes.
New York. At UCLA, they not only have Mel Nimmer, but Monroe
Yeah.
Price on their faculty was a Nathan Birkin winner, and Arthur Rosette on
Yes.
their faculty was a Nathan Birkin
Yes.
winner. And so I find, going around law schools in the country
Yes.
where I give lectures, I find that my associates on the faculty are usually former Nathan Birkin winners, which is very
And,
interesting.
When we arrived at a compromise for the revision on the jukeboxes, we had trouble getting someone to put forward the compromise in the Congress.
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
I remember, you had had a meeting with the jukebox people one weekend after that fateful Thursday when the
Yeah.
bill was up on the floor.
On Sunday,
You had a meeting on Sunday with the jukebox people. Now, I guess you must have met with the cable television people too, but somebody met with them.
no,
Because I got a call from Manny Seller, who was chairman of
Yeah.
Judiciary, the next day, Monday morning, bright and early, 8 o'clock. He said over the weekend there were meetings with the jukebox people and the cable people. He said the cable situation, you don't have to worry about that. He said it was agreed that the cable provision, the cable section would be referred to the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee.
we just met with the jukebox.
Well, then somebody else met with the cable people. But this was worked out over that same weekend. And he said in the jukebox area, the Register of Copyrights, Mr. Kaminstein, had a meeting with the jukebox people, and they are willing to withdraw all their objections to revision. And their objections were such that on the Thursday when that bill was on the floor of the House, they and the cable people had gotten together and had gotten through enough amendments to make the revision bill so much worse than the 1909 law that we lost interest in revision unless things could change.
Yes.
Well, Congressman Seller said that if our people would go for the $8, revision would go through the House the next day. And I said, well, I can't give you an answer. I have to talk to my clients.
Yes.
I said, how long do I have? I don't remember whether you said you have until 8:30 or what it was. It was a very short period of time. And I got some people out of bed, and I called him back within a half hour. And I told him that we would go for the $8. Now, this bill then went over, it passed the House.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then it went over to the Senate, where it stayed for almost 10 years. And in the Senate, we could have gotten that $8 increased by 26% to reflect the cost
Yes.
of living increase.
Yes.
And Tom Brennan got in touch with Cindy Kay and me about that. Sidney was for taking the 26%, and I was opposed to it. I said if we took it, when this bill got back to the House, the jukebox people would say we had welched on a deal,
Yep.
and that they, in my opinion, had enough power to block revision. And if we wanted revision to go through, we'd better stick to the $8. But that's that accords pretty much with your memory of it, doesn't
No,
it, Tammy?
yeah, because I stayed on the phone all that Monday, talking back and forth to the jukebox people. And it wasn't till late in the afternoon that they agreed.
This was after your meeting on Sunday. Now, I didn't know that you had to have further meetings.
This is all
But
in
that-
'67, right?
67, April of 1967. That's the way laws are made.
Copyright laws, anyway.
Well, and we had trouble getting someone to introduce the copyright, the compromise the next morning.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Who finally did?
Well, Congress, I don't remember who was, but it wasn't the congressman who had objected to it.
I thought in those hearings, of course, Kastenmeier did an outstanding job. I thought Dick Poff
Yeah, he
was
he was the mainstay of the committee. He was the ranking member, the Republican side, and until we had those sessions after the hearings, the committee was split, and he held them together.
yes.
He,
Here was somebody without any
Yes.
previous knowledge of copyright, who I thought mastered the subject pretty completely.
He said, Barbara and I and Goldman went over there in something like 52 sections, each one lasting an average of 2.5 hours, and he said it was like a course in copyright, and at the end of it, the entire subcommittee voted all the way down.
Yes.
Yes, he amazed me. I went into Dick Poff's office after the bill passed that Thursday, and I said to him, gee, I've observed you here, and you've done a great job. What's your goal in life? He said, what's wrong with being a congressman? Of course, he'd later been mentioned for the Supreme Court.
But he
and
turned that down and now is on the Supreme Court of Virginia.
yes.
He's a good man.
That whole committee,
Yeah.
that was a good committee.
Best.
Mhm.
Yes, and they had almost everybody there at every hearing.
Yeah,
Which was
because
amazing.
We have records of who attended and who didn't. But it was a good subcommittee to begin. It had former, now Congressman Fias on it, and as originally had Lindsay.
That's right.
I was at Wacy Mansion one day, the mayor's home in New York. There was a party to Manny Seller there. I forget what the occasion was. And I went up to the host, John Lindsay. He said, well, do you remember those days when we were working on copyright? And he remembered it, just as if it were yesterday. Which,
I was in his office when he was seeking money to run for mayor, and I think he called Rockefeller, and I turned me, and he said no go. So, he was a good man.
If I went into Lindsay's office before a hearing, he'd always say, now get to the point fast, and it'll take about 3 minutes. Yes, he could absorb it fast. An able fellow.
Yes. He always introduced the bill to give to restore the previous tax situation to authors.
Oh yes, yes, he was very much interested in that.
And I think Clark was more interested in that bill than he was in revision.
Yes.
Yes.
I can see his point.
Oh yes. Irwin has done a good job for authors, I think. He's not always the easiest fellow to get along with, but after all, that can be said about a lot of us, I think. Who am I to say anything about that?
Speaking of Mr. Poff, I remember the occasion when you told he asked you as a witness. He said, "Well, it's just a question of money, isn't it, Mr. Finkelstein?" And tell us what you told
Now
him.
you tell what your recollection is. What do you remember is my reply.
And Irwin said, "Most things in life are, Mr. Congressman."
Unfortunately, I think that's so true in the real world,
course.
apart from personal relationships.
Certainly.
Well, this has been a very good session. I
Indeed.
hope you have time to come back and do another session.
Oh, we certainly want you to, very definitely.
Well, I look forward to it. This has
Great.
been a lot of fun.
And we'll have Miss Ringer here. She wanted to be here today, but she just couldn't. And,
She's doing a great job.
yes.
Barbara is how she gets the time to do what she has done over the years
Well,
is amazing.
and many attorneys in New York were opposed to her appointment at first. She's, I know when she had to sue the librarian too?
On that one, I was embarrassed. I can tell this, I think, because I was for Barbara. And then a time came when Quincy Mumford made it clear he would not appoint Barbara, period.
Yeah.
Now, we were worried as could be that some user would be appointed Register of Copyrights. And I went to two people asking them to be candidates. And one said that no, he wasn't interested. That was Tom Brennan. And the other was George Carey. He said, "What do I want it for?" He'd had a heart attack and he thought it was too much of a thing to undertake. And I said, "Well, the rumors are that so-and-so might be appointed, and that would be a terrible tragedy." George was for Barbara, as I understood it.
He wasn't until the pressure was put on.
Yes, when we couldn't get Barbara, we wanted to be sure it wasn't a user. But it all ended very well.
By the way, speaking
Barbara-
of user, we're not talking about users of drugs. We're talking about
Users of copyrightable material.
Do they, today when they talk about users, do they associate it with drugs?
And she hasn't, if Barbara hadn't come back from when she did, we would still be struggling with revision.
I think that's right. Yes, Barbara was the same about revision that Arthur Fisher was about the Universal Copyright Convention. Except that Barbara probably did more direct work than Arthur did on it. Arthur's main work, I think, was in getting people to get the politicians to move.
Well, we should also mention Mr. Kaminstein here.
Well-
Without Mr.
Oh,
Kaminstein,
oh.
there would have been no revision.
I think that we made that
No.
abundantly. We haven't talked about that
No,
at all.
we're not yet.
Let's cut out now.
Okay.
Yes, I was reading back some of my notes on those early discussions. You had this copyright panel. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, the panel, those meetings with Cami in the chair, they were fabulous, just fabulous.
Yes. He would tell us where we got off at times.
Yeah,
He had
yes, I
no
noticed that.
hesitation about it.
Oh,
Fine.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.